Two brothers are standing inside the restaurant they built. Their name is on the business. Their system has already changed the restaurant industry. And the company carrying their name is spreading across America. But there is a problem. They no longer control it. Richard and Maurice McDonald had created the system that made fast food possible. They had invented a way to turn hamburgers into something almost industrial, cheap, consistent, fast, and repeatable. Then a 52-year-old salesman named Ray Kroc arrived. Within 7 years, Kroc would buy the brothers out for $2.7 million. And the strangest part wasn't that they sold their company. It was what happened afterward. The brothers kept their original restaurant in San Bernardino, but they had sold the rights to the name. So the men who created McDonald's could no longer call their own restaurant McDonald's. They renamed it the Big M. And then Ray Kroc opened a new McDonald's nearby. The restaurant with the famous name survived. The brothers' restaurant didn't. So how did two men who invented the system behind one of America's greatest businesses end up watching someone else build an empire from their idea? The answer begins long before the Golden Arches. It begins with two brothers who weren't trying to build an empire at all. They weren't trying to change America. Richard and Maurice McDonald came from New Hampshire and eventually moved west to California. Like millions of Americans during the early 20th century, they were looking for opportunity. At first, they weren't obsessed with hamburgers. They were interested in Hollywood. The brothers worked around the movie business, and for a time they even owned a theater. But California was changing. Cars were becoming central to American life. Families were moving outward from city centers. Roads were expanding. And restaurants were adapting to customers who didn't necessarily want to park, sit down, wait for a waiter, eat slowly, and leave. They wanted food that fit the automobile. The brothers noticed. In 1940, Richard and Maurice opened a drive-in restaurant in San Bernardino. It was called McDonald's Barbecue. And at first, it looked nothing like the McDonald's people know today. There was a large menu. There were car hops. Customers pulled into the parking lot and waited for someone to bring their food. Barbecue was a major part of the business. The brothers had built a successful drive-in. But success was about to expose a problem. Most of their customers weren't really coming for the barbecue. They were coming for hamburgers. And that changed everything. 2. The crazy idea of selling less. By the middle of the 1940s, the McDonald brothers noticed something that would eventually become the foundation of the entire fast food industry. A huge portion of their business came from hamburgers. That meant the complicated restaurant they had built wasn't necessarily the thing customers wanted. The customers wanted something simpler. So the brothers made a decision that sounded almost backward. They would sell less. In 1948, they temporarily closed the restaurant and redesigned the operation. They eliminated car hop service. They reduced the menu. They concentrated on a handful of items: hamburgers, cheeseburgers, French fries, milkshakes, drinks, coffee, pie. The hamburger became the center of the system, priced at just 15 cents. But the real innovation wasn't the hamburger. It was the kitchen. The brothers reorganized food preparation around speed and consistency. Instead of treating every customer order like an individual restaurant experience, they divided the work into specialized steps. One person handled one task. Another handled another. Food could be prepared repeatedly in almost exactly the same way. The restaurant began to resemble something that didn't belong in a traditional kitchen. It resembled a factory. And that was the breakthrough. The McDonald brothers weren't just selling hamburgers. They were selling a system. The customer didn't have to wait for a meal to be cooked from scratch. The meal was already built into the process. The fewer choices there were, the easier it became to control the operation. The simpler the operation became, the faster the food could move. And the faster the food moved, the more customers the restaurant could serve. The brothers had solved one problem, but they had created a much bigger possibility. If the system worked in San Bernardino, could it work somewhere else? 3. The system becomes the product. The success of the redesigned restaurant attracted attention. The McDonald brothers realized they had something that could potentially be reproduced. They began franchising their system. But here is where the story takes an important turn. Richard and Maurice McDonald were interested in expansion. They just weren't interested in expansion at any cost. They wanted control. They wanted the restaurants to operate according to their system. They also wanted a life outside the business. That distinction would eventually become one of the most important differences between the brothers and the man who replaced them. The brothers saw McDonald's as a successful restaurant system. Ray Kroc saw something else. He saw a machine for building an enormous company. In the early 1950s, the brothers promoted their restaurant system to potential franchisees. They even sold the plans and operating concept to people willing to pay for it. But they didn't immediately turn the company into a nationwide empire. That wasn't their personality. They had built something that worked. They were comfortable with it. And then, in 1954, one of the people who came to San Bernardino wasn't simply interested in copying the restaurant. He was interested in multiplying it. His name was Ray Kroc. 4. The salesman who saw the future. Ray Kroc was not a young entrepreneur when he arrived. He was 52. He had spent years selling products, including paper cups and milkshake machines. By 1954, he was selling a machine called the multi-mixer. Most restaurants didn't need many. The McDonald brothers had ordered 8. 8 machines for one restaurant. Kroc wanted to know why. So he traveled to San Bernardino. What he saw stopped him. A small restaurant was producing an extraordinary volume of food from a remarkably limited menu. Hamburgers, freeze, milkshakes. And customers were being served quickly. Kroc recognized something the brothers had already created, but had not fully exploited. The system wasn't dependent on San Bernardino. It could travel. And if it could travel, it could scale. The brothers were looking for a franchise agent. Kroc offered to become that person. The arrangement gave him the opportunity to develop McDonald's restaurants beyond the brothers' original territory. For Kroc, this wasn't just another sales opportunity. It was the opportunity to build the company he had spent his entire career looking for. But there was a problem. The brothers wanted McDonald's to remain controlled. Kroc wanted it everywhere. That difference was about to become a war over the future of the company. 5. 2 men, 2 visions. In 1955, Ray Kroc opened his first McDonald's restaurant in Des Plaines, Illinois. It was a crucial moment. For the first time, the brothers' system was being pushed aggressively into a market far from California. And Kroc discovered something important. The restaurant itself was only half the challenge. The real challenge was making other people reproduce the same experience. That required standards. It required training. It required suppliers. It required franchisees. It required real estate. And above all, it required control. Kroc became increasingly focused on creating a business where a customer could walk into a McDonald's in one city and expect essentially the same experience in another. This was more than restaurant management. It was standardization at scale. The company eventually formalized this philosophy through training and operating procedures. Hamburger University, established in 1961, became one of the symbols of that approach. The goal wasn't to turn people into chefs. It was to teach them how to operate a system. And that was exactly where Kroc's vision began separating from the brothers. Richard and Maurice had invented the machine. Kroc wanted to control the machine. The brothers still believed that changes should be carefully controlled. Kroc believed that growth required speed. And every time the brothers said no, Kroc saw another obstacle. Every time Kroc wanted to move faster, the brothers saw another risk. The partnership could work only as long as those 2 visions remained compatible. Eventually, they weren't. 6. The business that was too big for its founders. By the late 1950s, McDonald's was no longer just a successful restaurant concept. It was becoming a national business. The company reached milestones that would have been difficult for the brothers to imagine when they were still operating a single drive-in. By 1958, McDonald's had sold its 100 millionth hamburger. Kroc's ambitions were even larger. He envisioned 1,000 restaurants in the United States. And the more restaurants appeared, the more valuable the McDonald's name became. That created a strange situation. The brothers had the original invention. Kroc was building the organization around it, and the person who controlled the organization was becoming more important to the future of the brand than the people who had invented the original system. This is the moment when the story stops being about hamburgers. It becomes a story about ownership, because creating something and controlling what it becomes are two completely different things. And the McDonald brothers were about to learn that distinction the hard way. 7. The $2.7 million decision. By 1961, the disagreement had reached its limit. Ray Kroc wanted control. The McDonald brothers wanted to protect the business they had created. Eventually, they agreed to sell their interests. The price was $2.7 million. The Library of Congress records the transaction as the sale of the McDonald's name and concept to Kroc at a time when roughly 300 restaurants were in operation. McDonald's own historical materials likewise place the acquisition of the brothers' company rights at $2.7 million. On paper, it looked like an enormous payday. Two brothers had taken a small California restaurant and turned it into a nationally recognized business. Now they were walking away with millions. But money wasn't the only thing changing hands. They were giving up control of the name. They were giving up control of the system. And they were giving up their place at the center of the company they had created. The name would remain. The arches would remain. The restaurant system would remain. But the brothers would gradually disappear from the public story. Ray Kroc became the face of McDonald's. And history began treating the company as his creation. There was an irony buried inside the deal. Kroc hadn't invented the Speedee Service System. The brothers had. He hadn't created the original restaurant. They had. But Kroc had done something they hadn't been willing to do. He had decided that the system was not enough. It had to become an empire. 8. The brothers lose their name. There was one final twist. The original San Bernardino restaurant was not simply swallowed into Kroc's new organization. The brothers retained the original location, but after selling the rights to the McDonald's name, they could no longer operate it under that name. So their own restaurant became the Big M. Think about what that meant. This was the place where the McDonald brothers had developed the system, the place where they had transformed a drive-in into a fast food operation, the place that had inspired Ray Kroc. Now customers could no longer find the name McDonald's on the building. And then Kroc opened another McDonald's nearby. The new restaurant had the name. The brothers had the history. The new McDonald's had the future. And that distinction mattered. As Kroc's chain expanded, the original restaurant struggled. The Big M eventually closed. The restaurant that had started the McDonald's story disappeared, while the company carrying the McDonald name grew into one of the world's largest restaurant businesses. The irony is almost too perfect. The brothers had created a system designed to make restaurants replaceable, and eventually, their own restaurant became replaceable. 9. What Kroc actually added. It would be easy to tell this story as if Kroc simply stole the brothers' idea, but that would miss the most important part. Kroc did not invent McDonald's, but he did help transform McDonald's from a successful restaurant concept into a massive organization. That required different skills. The brothers were innovators. Kroc was an expansionist. The brothers optimized the restaurant. Kroc optimized the business around the restaurant. The brothers asked, "How can we make this restaurant work better?" Kroc asked, "How can we make 10,000 restaurants work the same way?" That is a very different question, and it required a different kind of company. Kroc pushed standardization. He developed the franchise organization. He surrounded the system with real estate, financing, training, management, suppliers, and aggressive expansion. The result was something larger than the original invention. It was a repeatable corporate machine. And once that machine existed, it could keep growing even after its original inventors were gone. 10. The golden arches become something else. The transformation continued. McDonald's didn't remain just a hamburger chain. It became a recognizable part of American life. The architecture mattered. The golden arches became an instantly recognizable visual symbol. Advertising became increasingly sophisticated. The menu changed as franchisees and executives discovered new opportunities. The Filet-O-Fish entered the national menu after being developed by Cincinnati franchisee Lou Groen. The Big Mac followed in 1968, developed by Pittsburgh franchisee Jim Delegati. These weren't simply random menu additions. They demonstrated another feature of the McDonald's system. The company could absorb ideas from individual operators and turn successful experiments into national products. That was the real power of the machine. A single restaurant could test something. If it worked, the system could multiply it. McDonald's had become a laboratory whose experiments could reach millions of customers. And then the scale became international. In 1967, McDonald's expanded into international markets, beginning with Canada and Puerto Rico. The company was no longer simply spreading a restaurant concept across America. It was exporting an American model of speed, standardization, and convenience to the world. The brothers' original restaurant had been built for drivers in San Bernardino. Now the system was being adapted for countries thousands of miles away. The idea had escaped its birthplace. 11. The reversal. And this is where the story becomes bigger than Richard and Maurice McDonald. Because the brothers' greatest invention wasn't the hamburger. It wasn't the golden arches. It wasn't even McDonald's. It was the idea that a restaurant could behave like a system. That idea changed the economics of food. Once food preparation could be standardized, businesses could expand faster. Once the process could be documented, workers could be trained more quickly. Once the restaurant could be reproduced, a brand could become larger than any individual location. And once customers learned to expect the same product everywhere, consistency itself became part of the product. That was the real revolution. The McDonald brothers had solved a restaurant problem. Ray Kroc turned that solution into a business architecture. And the architecture was more powerful than its inventors. That is why their story is so unusual. They didn't lose because their idea failed. They lost because their idea succeeded beyond the scale they were prepared to control. 12. The brother who disappeared from his own story. Maurice McDonald died in 1971. Richard lived much longer. But neither brother became the household name that Ray Kroc became. That tells us something about how business history works. We often remember the person who scales an invention. We remember the executive who builds the corporation. We remember the face on the television commercial. We remember the person who takes the idea global. But the person who originally solves the problem can disappear. And in McDonald's case, that disappearance was especially strange. The company's name still carried the brothers' surname. Every sign reminded customers of McDonald. Every restaurant preserved the identity. But the men themselves were no longer running the company. The name survived. The founders didn't. And that distinction is at the heart of this entire story. 13. The real battle was never about hamburgers. Look back at what happened. In 1940, the McDonald brothers opened a drive-in. The drive-in had a problem. Too much complexity. So they simplified it. That created the Speedee Service System. The system created another opportunity. It could be franchised. Franchising created another problem. How do you control dozens, then hundreds, of independent operators? Ray Kroc entered that problem. His answer was standardization and expansion. But expansion created another problem. Who controls the growing company? That question eventually led to the brothers selling. And the sale created the final irony. The brothers gained money. Kroc gained control. The McDonald's name became more valuable. And the men who created it became less visible. This is the pattern hidden inside the entire history. Problem. Solution. Consequence. New problem. Again. The restaurant wasn't designed to become an empire. The system made an empire possible. The empire then required a different kind of organization. That organization eventually made the founders unnecessary. And that may be the most important lesson in the entire story. Climax. The empire they never built. Imagine going back to San Bernardino in 1948. The McDonald brothers are standing inside their redesigned restaurant. There are no massive advertising campaigns. No global corporation. No billions of dollars in annual sales. Just a small kitchen organized around a simple question. How can we serve more people, faster, without sacrificing consistency? Their answer changed American food. But they didn't necessarily see the future hiding inside the answer. They saw a better restaurant. Ray Kroc saw a system that could be replicated. And once the system was replicated, the restaurant became something else entirely. It became a platform, a franchise model, a supply chain, a training system, a real estate strategy, a marketing machine, eventually, a global symbol. That is why the McDonald brothers' story isn't really about two men who failed to recognize their own invention. They recognized it. They just valued it differently. They wanted a successful business that worked. Kroc wanted a business that could keep multiplying. Neither vision was inherently irrational, but only one was built for an empire. And when the two visions collided, the empire went with Kroc, ending the name that outlived the men. Today, McDonald's has grown far beyond the little restaurant the brothers opened in California. The company now operates more than 36,000 restaurants across more than 100 countries. But if you stand in front of a McDonald's sign, there is still one thing you see before almost anything else. The name. McDonald's. The name of two brothers who wanted to make a better hamburger restaurant. Richard and Maurice McDonald created the system. Ray Kroc created the scale. And the scale ultimately became more powerful than the people who created the original idea. That's the contradiction at the center of the story. The brothers didn't lose their empire because they failed. They lost it because the thing they invented became too powerful for the kind of business they wanted to run. They created a system designed to make the restaurant independent of the individual. Eventually, that included themselves. And perhaps that is the strangest thing about McDonald's. The company was built around repetition. The same food, the same process, the same experience, the same name, over and over again. But behind that enormous machine was a story about two brothers whose own version of McDonald's disappeared. The golden arches survived. The system survived. The name survived. The empire survived. But the men who started it lost control of the very thing that made their name famous. And that raises one final question. If you invent something that becomes an empire, but someone else builds the empire, who really deserves to be called the founder?